Hi, this is Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today I'm talking with a very talented musician, composer, thinker, technologist, and many things, Brian DOliveira. He is based in Montreal and has recently contributed to the Resident Evil franchise. Prior to that, games like Papo YO and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. He's a wonderful guy. Our conversation goes a bunch of different places. It was mired by all kinds of microphone problems, technical problems. His fire alarm went off in his building. The internet dropped a few times. So there may or may not be little cutting in and out around our little glitches, but we had a good time because he's an incredibly likable guy and he had a lot of wonderful things to say. So regardless of the hiccups, I think you'll enjoy it.
Welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook, a podcast featuring a series of in-depth one-on-one conversations between game makers providing a thoughtful, intimate perspective on the business and craft of interactive entertainment. The Game Maker's Notebook is presented by the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, a member-driven organization dedicated to the recognition and advancement of interactive entertainment.
All right. I am here with Brian DOliveira, a name I never feel like I can say with a huge amount of confidence of correct pronunciation, although it's no Gustavo Santaolalla. But to be clear, am I saying that correctly?
You're saying it perfectly, actually. So, yeah, kudos, because a lot of people do mash it up quite a bit.
Well, yeah, what do you normally hear? Do you have is there a standard kind of brutal butchering that is most common?
There's so many. DOliveira, DOliveira, Oliveira. It's just, they just mess it up.
Virgin olive oil.
Yeah, and I get called Brain a lot too, which is...
Brain?
Yeah, because of Brian, but, everybody reads it.
I mean, it's obvious how, but, has anyone ever met a brain that's not accompanied by Pinky? That's a very odd... That's amazing. I mean... You could do worse. I don't hate the idea of calling you brain olive oil.
Well, it's a good one.
Well, that's very funny. Well, appreciate you doing this. This of course will be audio only, but at the beginning you inadvertently gifted me with a nice little quick whirlwind studio tour. So I guess why don't we just kick off by saying, where are you recording from? Well, I'll prime you for all kinds of questions on your background and your history of music making and all that sort of fun stuff. But just give us a rundown on your setup, because anybody that's seen behind the scenes work, footage of whether it's Tomb Raider or New Resident Evil, we always kind of get a glimpse of your space, and it always seems like a wonderful little laboratory of a mad scientist. So tell me a little bit about it.
It's interesting you said it like that, because when I got this space, I was envisioning it like a laboratory where each room had its own kind of thing going on, and we would just fill it up with as many instruments and possibilities as we could, and then we just, depending on the project, just be able to just shift things and configure the whole facility as a kind of living being, an entity in itself. And that's the way it's kind of worked out for the last 5 years. It's been an amazing experience, though. Actual space has a huge amount of history. It's the original RCA Victor studio in Canada and one of the first in the world. It was built in 1942. So Emil Berliner, when he came and founded his factory here, this was the main studio where they would have bands come in from 9 to 5 recording on a schedule. And the Victor studio put a lot of recordings, especially jazz recordings. It was actually a lot of the black musicians back in the times came here. So people like Oscar Peterson, even supposedly Ella Fitzgerald, and even Frank Sinatra recorded in the space. And
wow.
Yeah, it's an amazing space in itself. If the walls could speak, there's magic in the air. And then it kind of got turned into research facility in the 60s. It was boarded up, and then the other side is like kind of we call it the satellite room because there's kind of this warehouse space where basically they made the first Canadian satellite. It was hanging in this huge space that we have here. So yeah, it turned into a military / space research facility. And then in the 80s, the person that was looking to do a studio found that they opened up the walls and they found the beautiful panels that you see there, right? And basically, it's been untouched since the 1940s. And it's a special thing because the room was built to resonate sort of like a a violin or cello in a certain sense. And I have to say that after spending a few years here, the system does work really well. There's, when I play certain notes, certain frequencies will resonate in the room differently. The room actually has like different, it's very balanced, but at the same time, there's different parts to the resonances. So I will move around and shift around depending on what I'm recording. It's kind of become in a sense, an extension or one of the main instruments that I use in my work, the actual space, which is something that I don't think a lot of people think about normally. But for me, it's a huge part of my creative process.
I would actually say for most composers, they do make it part of their process, but the exact opposite way. They move around to avoid the problems of their space. They are, like there's a huge amount of kind of bass buildup over there, or there's, like if someone's working in a really tight kind of squared off room with a huge amount of reflection, they're putting up paneling and diffusers and whatnot to just try to mitigate the horror sound. Like you're able to kind of lean the opposite direction that most folks who aren't working out of what is effectively a tailor-made recording space, that they're just trying to kind of mask the deficiencies, which is what a wonderful thing that you've got going there. It's something that I actually have no idea the answer to, because I think you've been there for most all the time that I've known you, but I don't have any idea how you ended up in that spot, or what the origin of how it went from research lab and Canadian satellites to eventually, the origin of music for Resident Evil. What's the transition there between those points?
Oh, well, actually in the 80s, so, it got closed off. It was just being used as a normal space. And then in the 80s, the guy who started Studio Victor, he called it Studio Victor in homage to the history of it. It was run for the last 30 years. It's been one of the main legendary recording studios here in Montreal, and pretty much anybody and everybody who was in the music scene the last 30 years recorded here. It's it's one of the meccas of Montreal for as a recording space. But what happened was, things got too expensive, and he ended up going out of business. And by chance, I found out about it, and I came to the space and fell in love with it. And just very luckily, I got the space and turned it into my personal studio.
So does that mean, just purely, forgive me if I'm asking improper questions, but I'm just curious, does that mean that you were in a position to essentially buy the building?
No, I'm renting. Unfortunately, I'm renting, and I might have to leave soon because they're going to build a vent for the subway just next to here, and there's going to be insane blasting and noise for years. So this might be the last bit of the magic that we get out of this. But I think I've at least, brought out the soul. The spirits have been very happy here and more, like literally the room moves. When I play, you hear like cracks and the whole room resonates. So it's kind of like it's, a haunted, alive room, if you want to call it that, in a literal sense.
Well, and God knows that proximate construction has been the bane of recording studios as long as they've existed. And there's stories of, I remember here in LA, Capitol Records was essentially lobbying the city to prevent a construction project nearby because they were going to be putting in a parking garage. And Capitol Records depends on this subterranean reverb plate chamber where they pipe in the sound off of their live room, bounce it off of reverb plates, and then record it on the opposite end of the room. And so they have basically an analog reverb pipeline that channels through the bottom of the building. And they said, we can't have jackhammers bleeding through the walls. And I think they were able to actually stall that project. But I remember in London, I think Air or Abbey Road, one of the two was coping with a similar challenge. And So that's a real shame. I hope you don't have to leave, man. That's an awesome situation, but it's a very common problem to face.
It is, and I've been preparing for it. And interestingly enough, I had a shoot here. I had to take away all my instruments. So just so you guys know, I have around over 1,200 instruments at this point. So what you see is actually what I showed you wasn't even all the instruments inside. The room is literally half filled with instruments. And when I took it away, the magic was not there. I realized, and then when I put them back in, so I've worked out a formula. So my next space is going to be something I think pretty special once I find the right spot.
Well, let's get to that then, because there are, broadly speaking, this is an overgeneralization, but there are kind of two types of composers. There's in a way, composers like me who are, for the most part, writing for other performers. I play piano in a very marginal kind of way, but not terribly well. And that's basically it. I own a few other things. I can in a studio environment kind of way, I can play a bunch of different percussion instruments. And I did a little bit of percussion ensemble in college, and dabbled in clarinet and trumpet at various points, but I could probably barely get a sound out of them if I tried today. So I go into the process knowing whether it's a full orchestra or a single flute player or guitarist or whatever, part of the joy of music making for me is in the collaboration. The other type of composer, broadly speaking, is one like you, who is this fountain of musicianship and performer of a near infinite, seemingly, number of instruments. And there's a great example in the film and TV world of a composer like you named Nate Barr, who did his big break a number of years ago was the TV show True Blood, the vampire show with Anna Paquin. But he has since then done tons of others. There's that show, The Americans, and Hemlock Grove, and he does a ton. He's doing the new Borderlands movie, funny enough, speaking of games, and he does a lot. He is someone, he started life as a cellist, and then just basically started collecting instruments, and now he plays seemingly everything. So I have nothing but admiration for you and he and the ones like you, because on the one hand, I value that as part of my process, there's a kind of novelty. I can kind of separate myself from the final product in a way and explore things with another musician who brings their own perspective. And I enjoy that as part of my process. That a guitarist might say, I could voice this way, and it might feel a little bit more natural. And then I could actually grab this harmonic that might sound interesting here. And it's as a non-guitarist, I wouldn't think to do that. But if I were a guitarist, I probably would have a strong opinion about why, no, it shouldn't be that way because I played it like this or what. So it's it ends up with its own eccentricities. Walk me through your development as this kind of musician and composer. Was this always the goal? I'm basically just building up this huge preamble as a way of saying I couldn't do what you do. I find it amazing. And it's also just conceptually very different. So I said a bunch of words at you, say a bunch of words right back at me.
Yeah. So all I can start it off with being, I did have this idea. It was actually out of necessity, really. Like all of us, we had to figure out a way. I wanted to get my music played by an orchestra, and I just accepted the fact that it might take a very long time before I can get there. So I decided to be my own orchestra and put in the time and blood, sweat, and tears and insane amounts of hours of practice. That's constant to get to at least a decent point where I could build it up. But along the process, I had a bunch of big discoveries. One of them was the first time when I was doing Papo YO, just before I went to the jungle in Peru and I did ayahuasca, and it opened up my mind. I realized I have no limitations, I had that sort of coming of age, vision. Okay, be over with the limitations. And I was like, you know what? I can do this. I can play any instrument I decide to play, and I can manifest whatever I need to do. And I started it, and that's that's what you hear in Papo Yo. It was just the very beginnings.
I don't think I realized that was like that substantial of a turning point in you creatively. I mean, obviously it was a professional turning point because the game, got a lot of attention and it put your name out there and it did a lot of things for your career and you did a beautiful job. It's the first time I was familiar with your work. I know, and at least I think, unless I'm remembering wrong.
Yeah, that was the time. Yeah.
Yeah, but I hadn't known that it was like on a personal level.
Yeah.
Such a kind of watershed. I mean, unpack that more then, because that's not a trivial thing to just kind of say, you know what, I can do anything. Like it usually takes someone, like a mentor or somebody shoving you that way, or like a personal dam breaking, like sometimes people have a trauma that they just like realize, oh, you know what, to hell with it. And or whatever. There's a lot of pathways that might lead to something that groundbreaking. How'd that happen?
Well, in a sense, it was a huge, I had a huge trauma to break, and part of it was being, kind of stuck. Before that, I mean, I was doing music, I was doing everything, but and I was actually mostly an electronic musician, believe it or not. I grew up.
Wow, that's so funny.
Creating Detroit techno. When it comes to sampling, I'm like. I grew, I started with like an S950, an EPS, 16 plus, and I was doing stuff from scratch and, playing live sets with 808, 909s and, a bunch of crazy analog synths from the time I was 15 years old, which is all great. But yeah,
and you mentioned Detroit. Was this in Detroit?
This is actually in Hamilton, Ontario. But funny enough, there was this huge connection with Detroit. So all the Detroit DJs used to come back and go there in the early 90s. And I discovered the scene. I mean, I was hanging out with Richie Houghton and John Aquaviva back in those days. And people like Caribou I grew up with.
What year range?
This is like 93, 92, 93, 94, like, back in the old days. So yes,
you're mentioning 808s. That's why I was curious if it was like current or you were being retro and you were pretty current.
This was like, I found an 808 for like $100 in a garage sale. Somebody lent me a 303 that they were throwing away. And then I was, I was 15, 16 throwing, underground warehouse parties, tweaking these beats and people going nuts live. This was my jam so before. Funny. And for many years, like live performance was my thing and composing. And then I was living in Toronto, went to Brazil, lived there for a bit, sold everything I had and, was doing music in the favelas there. And then by the beach doing, living like a crazy life. And then I came to Montreal, started the studio.
Very bohemian, I guess.
Yeah. Just self-discovery. And I was doing music. It was all great. I knew that I was meant to be a composer. I knew that from the very beginning, but I started on the path doing the usual that you do. You do all kinds of different styles of music, play a few different instruments. But yes, when I got to Papo, I was like, I have to, it's now or never. I have to just break that beyond what I'm doing right now and go into something else. And that's what happened. And then from there onwards, I actually started going to India almost every year, and I was spending 1 or 2 months a year there, doing heavy training with two of my masters. And part of it was waking up at 5 a.m. and singing one note for the first hour while you're still barely awake and asleep in the dark with a tempura, with a drone. And that kind of training, that mind meditation kind of training was another big part of the ability to master things very fast, because it was the idea that you can sing. I would have to sing one note in perfect tune for an hour straight, and that training of listening and having that sensitivity allowed me to start hearing like microtonalities in a very exact and precise ways.
Well, not to mention the muscle memory of like the diaphragm, learning very precisely the difference that it feels in the body of, from this to that, et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
How long was this period of time? Did you say that you were kind of in this?
It's been happening actually since, for at least the last like almost 10 years now. And the only reason I'm not in India right now is because of what's been happening. But it's an ongoing training that I do and an ongoing practice. So, every morning if I can. I'm singing at least 1 or 2 hours a day. That's actually from there. Even though I was playing all these other instruments, but what kind of happened was that between that and playing cello, which is also, I would say, one of the more difficult instruments you can play, I kind of trained. I had the muscle memory and the mind sensitivity to be able to just grab other instruments and quickly pick them up. So that's kind of been, if you want to think of sort of like secrets and having masters, that's kind of having a master sort of teaching you this stuff. This was kind of like my shortcut in to be able to, in a very short time, master so many instruments so quickly.
That's just amazing. I like, it would be inevitable that someone would build this into their process. But was that a conscious choice for you? Meaning, because you've now really built that kind of reputation as like somebody that kind of hatches these scores up essentially from the ground up by yourself. I guess another way to ask what I'm getting at is that by design? Like if someone said, we really want to do a traditional orchestral score, would you jump into it and
totally
say, oh, great. Or is this like what you're describing? Is it just music making at this point for you? I'm just curious to what extent it's kind of become part of your identity since it's so personal.
Well, it definitely is a very strong part of the identity and just way that I work. I like to sit down and I'll just, spend a lot of time internalizing what's going on with the project. And then I sit there and I lay down the tracks. Like I've gotten to the point where, for the most part, I try to, it's kind of like a self-challenge. Like I do one take and that's it. And then I go next track. I have to work really fast usually. So I'll build like 100 tracks within like maybe a day or two, depending, but very quickly, I'm not going back, like no hesitation. This is the arrangement. I play the full take, and then I just keep on going forward without any kind of, overthinking and overgoing. At the same time, I'm not just stuck on that process. I do like to sort of like switch things up and change it up. So, right now I'm doing a lot of electronic music again. I'm resampling and reinventing sort of like a way that I can do a lot of expressive things using sampled content and making my own instruments as well. So yeah, it's although it's been something that I've mastered and I keep on working at it, I'm not stuck in there. Definitely not, and actually, if anything, if I had to sit down and write a score out by hand, I would more than welcome it because it's, it's another facet and it's another way and approach to come up with music, and the music will come out differently. That's the fun part of this kind of work.
Yeah, well, certainly. It makes me also realize there's something that I've always been curious about, because my process has often involved a certain amount of planning and having a sense of where things are going. And this is maybe because I don't work the way you're describing, where I'm just playing and got a mic on, and then I'll play relative to what I just laid down. And that's actually essentially my question. To what extent are you planning these things? Because I found, especially, I have a lot of interest in harmony. And I don't think I could just perform, layer by layer, the kind of harmonic language I like to write. I don't know that my brain is capable of holding that much information kind of suspended in the air at a time. But that's just how I'm wired. So how do you even, I know we're getting a little bit kind of inside baseball with this stuff, but that's what, it is what it is.
By all means.
How do you navigate that kind of thing? You're not like writing a sketch for yourself and then playing it. It sounds like you're really just kind of, you lay down a track and then you listen to that while playing the next one. And then you're listening to the two of those while playing the next one, and on we go.
Yeah. And reacting and moving in the space and even, I think even of, when I pick up each instrument, it's a different character. It's another being. And I'm just letting the instruments and myself, do the thing that it does in accordance to what we're building as well. To be honest,
how do you even just pausing on that little thing, and then we'll get back to the kind of process. How do you even make that call? Meaning, if you've got 1,200 instruments in front of you, what drives grabbing this one versus that one in a situation like that? Is it purely spontaneous?
Yes and no. It depends on the situation. I do know my instruments extremely well. Like every single one of them, it's like it's it's part of me literally at this
Mm.
point, because I spent hundreds of hours with here in this room doing this, probably thousands actually I should say. But there's a kind of I actually spend a lot of time before thinking about it, internalizing the idea. I do maybe sometimes have a plan, but when I'm there, I try not to get stuck with the plan. I'm also going to go with the moment and see what happens as I'm building it. So it's kind of a twofold approach. Uh, I know
Interesting.
that's it's like, well, it's one or the other, but it's both really.
No, I totally get it. The extra wrinkle then becomes, how do you grapple with like getting feedback and revisions from an audio director or somebody, if they come back and say, oh, well, like perfect example is if I'm doing a mock-up and they say, the piece feels like it's kind of dragging. I like it, but I just wish it was 10 clicks faster.
Oh
Like
yeah,
that,
that's hard.
that's a nightmare for you, and it's trivially easy for me. But then there's other things that are trivially, if they say, oh, that just can you get rid of that one sound, that part pulls me out, then you just mute that channel and 99 out of the 100 go to the game. Like, how do you just constantly re-record or do you audio edit?
Yep, that's the disadvantage and the advantage. So what you see is what you get. If they hear what they like and they like it, they're almost pretty much getting the final product. Like I've recorded it, mixed and mastered it as I'm going along and creating this. It's done. It's basically done. And if they like it, we just do a quick, once over, any kind of smaller revisions and ship it out. And it's something that even with a lot of audio directors, they've had to get used to it, and and in a good way. I think that everybody I've worked with kind of enjoys it once they get into the flow. But then because of that, I do a lot of work before. There's a lot of preemptive preparation. I will spend maybe like even months on just like one or two pieces, just making sure that, okay, this is the vibe that you're going for. And then from there, I'm able to expand it and go crazy with that musical language and sonic, palette and instruments that I've kind of put together for the project.
Yeah, that's the whole what you see is what you get is something that they're probably very much not used to, because one of the big recurring challenges that I don't think we've personally ever talked about, but which always comes up and which I get asked about a lot from people just starting, is always kind of on the nature of mock-ups and how realistic they ought to be. Because, if you're doing a thing where there's not going to be a recording budget and the samples are it, then obviously it's on you to be as good at that as you possibly can be, because it is what you see, what is what you get. My general philosophy has been, I don't really like to write something that can't be produced by my definition how it ought to be. So if I'm writing for strings, I want to record the strings. It's okay if it's a small string section. It's okay if it's a big string section, blah, blah, blah. But like, I don't want MIDI strings in a final product of mine. And if we can't afford that, well, maybe you just write for solo cello, or maybe something completely different. Maybe we go
awesome.
full, so that's kind of one of my little personal rules. Now, every now and again, there's gray areas, but generally I've been able to hold to that and say, it's to the audio director, it's to your advantage that I have this rule, because it means that whatever we ship will not sound like the inferior version of an alternate universe where we had a little bit more money and we could have done it right. It will always sound the way it's supposed to sound. And the result of which, though, is that because I know I'm going to be replacing and recording, I sometimes get a bit complacent with the quality of my mock-ups, because I'm like, what does it matter? But it does require that I rely on them to understand the difference. And if they're giving me feedback based on a shitty sounding mock-up and not hearing through to the composition, that can sometimes be like a translation error that will go in circles. And then I'll realize, oh, you liked the piece, you just hate my oboe sample. And that's always that's an inherent risk in what I do. And it's fascinating and amazing to me that you have none of that. But there's also something more. It gives me a little bit of a shield. If they don't like it, there's probably other variables between them and me that like I can put in the rain of bullets. Whereas you, it's like, no, we don't like this. It's like, that
Yeah.
you've just put all of your soul into writing and recording and performing, and it's how does it not feel like we don't like you personally? I mean, I feel like it would be really difficult to train a detachment knowing that it's something that's so tangibly me.
Yeah. I've had
Am I
my
tapping into,
ego
is this about to
crashed.
be
No,
okay?
no, this is all good. I mean, yeah, to be honest,
My
like
therapy
you
rates are very fair
we might have to talk about that sometimes.
yeah.
But yeah, yeah, it's been very painful a lot of times.
You
The
must have
nice
had
thing, at least,
instances. Oh, sorry, continue, go ahead.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Well, no, finish your thought.
Yeah,
I'll remember.
there's been a lot of times where I think I must have spent, wasted hundreds of hours on stuff because a lot of it has to comes down to communication.
Yeah, of course.
Because if you just tell me what you want, we can do it. But half the time as composers, I think we have to read people's minds and, do all these litmus tests to see what they're actually thinking is blue, blue, is red, red,
Not just that, but also bearing in mind that they may be still calibrating what red is in their mind. So even if we read
Exactly.
it, it's a moving target inside their head. They're still finding it in their own right.
Totally.
Which is the extra challenge, So our mind reading, in other words, even as a perfect mind reader, it wouldn't be a silver bullet solution.
It isn't, and that's part of the challenges of what we do as a profession. But it is what it is, But that's why I do take a lot of time. If I work with somebody, I'm really lucky because people kind of know how to work now, and they come to me to work in this way for the most part. And I will take a lot of time, and for me, it's like literally 80 or 90% of R&D, workshopping it, and then the execution can go really fast a lot of times. For the most, that's kind of been the pattern. Like I'll spend like 6 months working it out, and in 1 or 2 months, it's the actual production process, and it all happens all at once. I mean, it happens like this with everybody, but it's much more concentrated, let's say.
Yeah, and what you're saying definitely resonates as familiar to me too, where I've invested heavily in that R&D phase in order to kind of create the formula of what defines this project. Like, what are the sounds that we're using? What's the language, like you said? So that I totally get with. But I have also had situations where 6 months in, we realized that formula that we greenlit, that I've been springing from, the reason why I keep getting so much feedback and so many notes is maybe the formula's wrong. Like they greenlit, like, okay, that theme, you're right, that's the theme, we love it. That mood, that vibe, we love it all. And then 6 months later, they realized, we were wrong, and I basically have to redo everything, including the R&D phase. Again, it's a huge drag when that happens. And obviously, the consolation is knowing we're probably going to end up with something even better. So it will have been worth it, but there's a certain gut punch of knowing everything that you've been doing for half a year is going in the trash. But it would seem so much worse for you because would anything be have you ever had that kind of situation before? You realize the bones that everything is springing from are cracked unto themselves, and you really are starting from scratch.
Totally.
After all that phase.
Totally. I won't name the project, but I think I must have done like over 400 and something minutes at a certain point of music, all original, all insane, and I pretty much had to start from scratch at a certain, but at the same time, I look at it as part of the learning process, part of the inner journey that we have as composers. Okay, let's see if we can make this better, and the music did turn out much better, and I grew as a creator, and a musician out of it. But yes, it's you just have to set aside your ego and go, okay, let's go with this, and let's go with the flow, and it is what it is.
In a case like that, what's the thing that reveals that the fundamental direction isn't working? Is it just because obviously sometimes we have that voice in our head that's going, I think I need to bring up that this direction is wrong. And then sometimes it's the audio director or the creative director or whomever that's struggling with that, saying, oh crap, I think I've led them down a wrong path, and trying to decide when to bring it up, and everybody's sort of dreading it. Like, what's the straw that breaks the camel's back, as it were? In the case of that specific project, do you remember what made you realize, oh crap, we have to retool this whole thing?
A lot of it would be funny enough, like user testing and feedback, and having the general crowd. So you know, the whole team's thinking one thing, but then when you actually get it in the hands of people playing through a game, it's another thing, and they see, you know, maybe probably different than from the inside. So that's a huge thing, and you know, I actually, that's another part of it. Like I try to actually, like, you know, as if I can get, if I can play through and get my hands on a playable, I'll play through and see if it's working. Go in there, get dirty, you know, see if the interactive system and how everything is reacting, and you know, all the stems that I've given, or you know, single elements, is it working as how it's meant to be? Does it feel right? You know, is it telling, you know, are we getting that visceral feeling when we need that, or it's telling the story properly? And you know, you know, like I think we all are, but for the most part, I try to be the harshest critic, and I'll tear stuff down way even before most people do. So I've been lucky that way. But as a the minus is also, you know, I get called on as too perfectionist sometimes, and you know, I have to let go sometimes. But again, that's just part of I think that's the persona as a composer. We're all guilty of that. And
well, but how do you? I think that we do tend to kind of, as a culture, have that challenge to cope with. How do you navigate it? Again, I think in your case, it's especially difficult to navigate because it's a very labor-intensive consequence for being that perfectionist. You know, like if it, like for example, I'll make up a hypothetical. You can tell me if I'm full of shit. If you've laid down a bunch of string passes and then you hear a give and take and you go, you know, I actually think that I like the line, but I need to do another take on it. I don't like my intonation, or I don't like the, you know, whatever I don't like the expression. I don't like this. I didn't just lose you, did I? Uh-oh.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now? I'm not hearing you properly, actually.
Oh, really?
Okay.
It's funny because you kind of blinked
You,
in and out, but I never stopped hearing you. Well, as long as you can hear me, we'll just. So when you are having to battle that perfectionist urge, how do you mitigate those instincts towards perfectionism, especially knowing that it's a very labor-intensive drain on your just your bandwidth, your time, you know, because you'd have to be either constantly refining a mix or constantly going back in, and like you've got 100 channels there and there's a cello sitting on channel 77 and you decide I can do a better take than what's there now, or I've thought of a different way to express it or to bow it or blah, 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 blah. And so the problem is that it's all subjective. So it's not like anyone will ever, the light will suddenly turn green and you'll realize, okay, I solved it, you know, like video games where, you know, like freaking Resident Evil Village, when you clear a room and the map room changes color. Like there is no such feedback in real life. So how do you mitigate this? Because it can actually be quite personally destructive.
So that's, yeah, you know, talking about composing rules, I don't go back. Whatever I lay down, it is what it is. And, you know, you'd have to twist my arm to have to do that. Like maybe once in a while I'll do it, you know, and this is just like, I always question myself, but I've kind of have this sort of state of mind of always going forward. And what I did, it's good. If I have to, I would rather almost like redo the piece than go back and have to rejig things completely.
Well, so then how does your perfectionism end up manifesting then, if not through those tweaks? Like what?
In the performance, in being really freaking dependent on myself. And and then there is some magic also that we can do with, you know, with post-processing. So at least with tuning and little tiny details, we'll go in there and clean it up. I used to do quite a bit, especially when I started with Papo. It was, you know, I did tweak a lot of live stuff. I've basically used, you know, audio like putty, like MIDI almost, you know, sometimes. But to these days, it's gotten to the point, you know, like, you know, when I'm doing like 60 hours a day of performing, you get in the zone and it does happen, and then it's just quick. So it's not to brag, but it's kind of at that sweet spot now. I can get a lot of pieces done very quickly and very efficiently.
Yeah, interesting. Going back, I realized something I wanted when we kind of briefly passed through Papo YO. knowing that that was such a big turning point for you, what about it made it that? What made you decide to go to the job? I mean, I guess you had already spent time in Brazil, and you'd kind of you'd gotten a flavor of what it's like to go and kind of make music in a different environment and with new people and that sort of thing. And like, I get that seed had already been planted, but what about that project made you suddenly shift gears?
Sorry, I just we just have a fire alarm going off in the studio. I'm gonna actually just shut down the doors. 1 second. Sorry, guys.
Make sure that you're not about to burn up.
I know. All throughout the building, but the nice thing is that I do have soundproofing in this room, so
it's like a panic room.
Yeah, I do have my panic room here, so I can actually just close the door, and we're not gonna get that.
That's nice. So funny.
So sorry, where were we?
All right, a little edit for fire alarms, dropping Wi-Fi, relocating. In my case, double checking, paused, Dropbox syncs. So just making sure. What about Papo YO made you turn this corner into such a different process than you had up to that point? Because like it's just such a big shift by the sound of it. Seems like something about that game kind of pushed you.
Yeah. It was the first time where I was doing a gig, and it turned out that it wasn't a gig per se. It was a way to just express myself as an artist, let's say. And because, when I met Vander, the creator of the game, he showed it to me, and he said, "Hey, I know what you're about. I know your story, and I want you to tell your story within my story here with Papo YO." And that's what I did. I just went full on. I was like, okay, let's see what Brian, the creator, can do in a real sense, not just trying to just fit this world, So it is basically the soundtrack of my childhood and kind of what I went through. I grew up in the Andes Mountains of Venezuela. The only thing super poor, playing only a flute. I had to basically teach myself everything from scratch. My mom was an artist. And even though we were super poor, I learned a lot from her, just in terms of being able to just create. She's like me too, actually. That I would say I got that from her, actually. It's the other way around. She could just look at something and paint it, and it would be perfect within a few minutes. She could do a portrait.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh no, not again. Oh. Okay, let's wait a couple of minutes. Sorry, guys.
We'll muscle through.
Yeah.
Oh, look at that.
Stop. Okay. We'll keep going.
Just testing us.
All
That's
right.
all
Yeah,
right.
it's one of those.
We'll leave it in and just showcase the raw reality of the Game Maker's Notebook.
Yep. But where was I?
You were talking about your mother, and I'm actually so excited to hear more about that, because when you said that the developer said, "I know your story. Tell your story." Is that what he meant? How did he know that? How did you guys connect?
Well, we're both from South America, and we chatted quite a bit and we hung out, and I kind of told him where I came from, what was happening, and we connected in that way because he, in a very different way, he also had a difficult childhood in Colombia as well. So there was that sort of parallel that happened, and growing up, actually, and this also ties into why I have so many instruments, and I try to do so much, because I was severely limited as a kid. I mean, I grew up. My mom was an artist, so she tried to do the best, but she could barely afford to even feed us a lot of times, and I would be the one trying to just budget for how much food we could eat for the rest of the week, kind of thing, And this is at 5 years old.
Wow.
But then, I had to, so I was like, okay, I got a flute. What can I do with a flute? What can I, fathom and teach myself and make this something, And it's that kind of attitude that and sort of hunger to be able to just work it out. That's, when I got to this point in life where I'm at, and that was kind of around Papo YO, I was like, okay, I can access whatever I need. I can get whatever instrument I want. Let's see what we can do. And this mental limitation of, no, you can only do one thing really well, and you should only play one instrument well, and that's it. I was like, no, let's break it open, and that's kind of that did happen, that was around 33 years old at that point. So it was kind of that coming of age time. I see that pattern happen a lot.
How did you even begin with the flute? itself, where did music even initially come from? Especially knowing that, there were more kind of existential priorities, we'll say, at that point in your life, just sort of getting by day. How did music enter into the fold?
It was, I mean, as soon as I picked one up, my mom like pretty much decreed it. She's like, "You're going to be a great musician," and she does have a pretty good intuition. And from there on, it was like, "Yep, it is." We both kind of just knew. I knew too, and it was just the way it was.
Wow, so matter of fact. Well, and so how did you? I'm curious. I kind of asked this, but in a more circuitous way than I meant to. How did you? You were talking about Vander and he being from Colombia and kind of how you connected, but how did you literally meet? Because by the time that game came into your life, you were already in Montreal, weren't you?
Yeah, yeah. So it was just like at this just random party, but we met, and within like 10 minutes, it was like we were like super old friends. Didn't even have to, like, yeah, you meet those kinds of people. It's almost like you've met them in other lives, and it's like, yep, we not even words needed. We just get it. We both, yeah, we're on the same level, and we can just talk on the same dimension. Let's call it that. And that's kind of what happened. And yeah, he was one of the people that kind of like opened it up and like, do what you do, Brian. And I did it, and here we are.
Well, it's funny because not long after that game came out and we first connected, and I could immediately feel that you were one of the good ones, as it were. You have such a kind of, you strike me as a very optimistic person, and you don't seem to have a cynical streak. At least you don't wear it openly or publicly, because when I think of all of our earliest interactions, of course, it's different from sitting with a beer and the back of a pub and really kind of getting into meaty subjects. Like I will acknowledge that our relationship was, still the early days, as all friendships are, initially surface level. So I don't want to pretend like I went straight into your soul, but nonetheless, you project a very positive attitude.
Oh, thank you.
And so it was very gratifying. I'll never forget when we bumped into each other at GDC. And kind of in passing, I was going one way, you were going the other way. And, it's kind of like, "Oh, how's it been going? What's been going on with you?" And you kind of hinted, "Well, I've actually working on a really big project and I'm super stoked, and it's going to be a long time before I can talk about it." And I'm pretty certain that ended up being Tomb Raider.
Yes.
And so it was one of those really, I remember feeling very distinctly, now there's a guy that deserves what's coming to him. Because you obviously work hard, and again, that positive attitude that you project, some people project that as a way of covering their demons, and it's actually maybe a sign of unhealth. And I certainly hope that's not the case for you. It didn't ever seem that way. It always felt very authentic.
Oh,
And so it was very gratifying to see, which takes us, of course, to the game of the hour. And I'm happy to say I've been playing the absolute bejesus out of Resident Evil 8 Village, and listening to your work, and it's been exciting to see what you've been sharing of the process and just the innumerable instruments. And why don't you just kind of walk me through some of your process and your thinking, and this, just as if I don't know anything.
Specifically with Resident Evil, or
Yeah.
just in
Well,
general?
yeah. Well, yes. I mean, specifically because these are, selfishly, it's all very fresh in my head. And I watched this wonderful video of you working with this singer. That was great. But I'd love to just hear in general about where the first conversations came from. And, this is, I guess, the part where I do sound slightly interviewee, but I would love to just know about from top to bottom, because, it's a hell of a piece of work. And it's obviously it's sort of one of the newest releases to capture people's attention. So walk me through your approach.
Yeah. So with Resident Evil, as you know, I worked on Resident Evil 7. I did I did a few tracks, but I also did a huge part of their sound set, creating their instruments that the team used. And when I got contacted by them, and they saw what I was doing already, and so they when we talked, it was kind of like it just made sense that for me to become like you build their next sort of sampled instrument set that the in-house team with Shusaku, leading it, would use as kind of like their foundations for their compositions. So they actually flew from Japan, and we spent a good few days just recording nonstop a whole bunch of different things. And at the same time, I'd already been researching to build my own virtual instruments. Since for me, like I would like that's another one of my passions, sampling and kind of sound mangling and using this. So while we were doing this, I was like, wait a minute, I've got this engine that I'm building. Do you guys want to use it? And they were totally down. And so it was a perfect kind of storm that happened. And I basically,
when you say building your own engine, you mean as a replacement to Contact, say?
Yes, basically my own version of Contact, but in my own way. And it's actually very game audio inspired. It's actually built as a nonlinear expression engine. So you guys know about real-time parameter controls, RTPCs. So I built RTPCs into pretty much all the main parameters and more. I had macros and cross modulation happening, but all controlled by RTPCs. So you move one slider, one knob, and you could get hundreds of different things happening at the same time. So that's kind of what I was building, and I had. Does that mean?
I don't mean to derail, because I really want to stick with Resident Evil, but I don't think I realized the potential for nonlinear composition in what you're doing. So does that mean that you would ship your equivalent of the Contact instrument in the game?
Not quite on this one, although I've done. This is kind of where I'm going in the future, actually.
That's why my ears perked up, because that's one of those things that I've thought, for years, this is going to be the future. If we can make really, really powerful custom libraries and things, then it will, the greatest scores from a nonlinear standpoint are going to be this dance between real-time rendering of some kind, either effects processing or literally like having MIDI like shipping with the game, driving onboarded instruments in a way like they used to do, back in the hardware synthesis days, 8-bit and 16-bit era. So you're ahead of the game here.
You could say a little bit. I've been thinking a lot about this. I did do a lot of the instruments for Dreams, for their Metaverse also. So I spent a lot of time. I've been doing instruments for quite a bit, and within games, it's already been happening. So it did open up my eyes, and I'm always like wanting to switch things up, but at the same time, I was like, this is where it's going, and that's why I've started a whole new division of the studio called Mantra, just building instruments. And even though we're starting just with VSTs versions, the idea is that we're going to be creating versions that will be running in these game engines and metaverses and whatever else it will be, because you just can. It's just, that's the way it's going. I mean, we all see it, so why not?
Exactly. Well, so all right. So then, going back to putting a pin in that massive, wonderful subject, going back then to Resident Evil, you said so. Obviously, the relationship had begun through that process of your building custom instruments for them. So then take it forward from there.
So the soundtrack you hear, and again, we have to get clearance to make sure that we get their blessings. But a lot of the soundtrack, when you hear it, it's actually me and my team playing a lot of these instruments, and then being replayed through the engine, and they're using my version. It was called Bruitage at the time, their own version of the engine, and that's what you hear, and I'm amazed at what they got out of it. So it's like it's actually a really interesting feeling where in a sense, I was kind of like the session musician, and then they got to play it all, and it's like, let's see what happens with Brian in a box. It's pretty gratifying, I have to say, actually.
Yeah, and they went places that you wouldn't have gone on your own.
Yeah, totally, and a different thought process, but using the same sound sets and my mojo there. And I'm open to that. Like this is great, man. Like why not? Let's open it up. Let's see what happens. You know. And then from there, they contacted me because they've been just trying to find just the right title song, and I they showed me the images, and right away I had randomly had been researching instruments from Indonesia and found this girl that had this beautiful voice that almost resembles Bjork, but in its own unique way. And she just happens to be this like really talented Polish girl that lives in London and has this beautiful way of singing with this accent that's just unique, and everything about her was unique. And she played she played a few like gamelans and a bunch of other Indonesian instruments. So just like completely out there, but amazing talent. So I got her on board. I wrote out the lyrics, the songs, did it on the spot. We had like maybe 2 days to do the demo. We did it, and here we are, with that piece. It became what it is now.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I so love the kind of archaeology of finding new talent, of finding people, whether it's on YouTube or, through Facebook or Twitter, where you just kind of come across, whether it's a unique singer or a performer who plays an unusual instrument or plays a familiar instrument in an unusual way, that's, to me, that the treasure trove of talent in this world is bottomless. And the discovery of those little gems is one of the most satisfying and exciting parts of this. So,
totally. And so like with my process, like I do have collaborators. Like sometimes I want to have strings played in a very different way. I bring in string players for that, very specific ones. And at least we can sit there, and then sometimes we'll just play an ensemble and do it up, So there's that magic that happens. I'm just maybe a little bit more hands-on because I know what's going on with, it's exactly with intonation, and I'll be very picky about certain lines and all that stuff, like, no, use this position, do that,
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, well, that's the thing. That's why I don't have those struggles. I have strong opinions on bowings and that sort of thing, but it's very different because it's coming from a place of an observer and a listener, and not from a inside out perspective, like we were talking about before. You feel it in your fingers, and when you see someone do it a different way, it's almost like a physical, like it would have come out of my body a different way than how you're doing it. And I think that's a very different relationship to that process than for me, who's perhaps more analytical about it. And it's coming from I like this bowing because of what I think it applies about the line and the sort of point of the melody, or whatever the case may be. It's not about my physical expression as a performer in any way. It's just fascinating, these very different relationships. And also, so just so I'm clear and that I'm not somehow confused, the instrument building was something that started on 7, like this, creating these custom instruments started on 7, and then essentially expanded dramatically on 8, right? On Village specifically.
Yeah.
Like that,
yeah.
like it's kind of the role that you had of kind of feeding to their music team material from which to work was something that began in a perhaps simple or smaller scope way and expanded on 8. But you did that fundamental role across both.
Yeah.
I'm not confused, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that was it. It was just a continuation.
Yeah.
In a sense. Yeah.
So how does the process on something like that work then? Since obviously that's a very different kind of thing from writing a cue, a Shadow of the Tomb Raider or Papo YO or even like the collaborations with Media Molecule, where setting aside the dreams thing, like how does that even work? Because obviously, so my question is just about the differences in process, because that's really different from a traditional composer role. And it's very easy for them to just, if you deliver something that they're not going to use, they just may not use it. So is there much of the feedback and iteration that might exist? Or are you basically just coming up with the wildest, craziest pile of instruments imaginable, and then they'll just pick and choose what they need or what they want?
Yeah, I would say it's the second one, but they happened to be here with me while we were doing it. So they were kind of like going, yeah, as we're going. And so it was immediate feedback. So it went pretty quickly, and I think they pretty much used everything that I had and more, and managed to, like, recontextualize it and use it in a bunch of crazy different ways, especially with the way that I'd set up the engine also.
Yeah, interesting. So how do you go about, like, is it a cousin of composing for you at that point? Because you're creating an instrument that's supposed to have potential for composing, someone else is going to carry forward. You're still, I would think, responding to the material of the game, though. You're still, like, they're still walking you through
totally.
the kind of story you're telling. So where does that line fall? Because I would personally probably find that very difficult, where I'd say, it'd be easier if I was just writing the cue. Like, how do you step back and sort of write to potential cues, knowing that they're going to take it somewhere? Like, that's a fascinating, different position for a composer to sit in. How do you even find the sweet spot there?
Well, the nice thing is that the team had a very good idea of the kind of instruments that they wanted, and so I was able to sort of secure pretty much all of them, like everything from like wind instruments to even like old World War II sirens and crazy things. Like it was nuts, and then it's just a matter of expressing it in a way that we knew would be useful. But the nice thing is that between me and my team, like before that, we've been sampling so much for actually recreating instruments that we kind of by instinct we knew what was going to work. So we just made sure that we got good takes that were useful, that had enough variety and enough material in them that it could be like mapped out properly, recontextualized, cut up in certain ways, and you'd be able to get quite a bit out of it. And it's not that different from what you do with a video game also. Ian, even with Tomb Raider, with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, even though it was mostly music, there were a lot of times I was creating a lot of stems and even individual kind of stemmed elements, but they're almost like stingers and one hits that the audio team and with a brilliant audio director with Rob Bridget, like he has the craziest imagination. He just took my stuff and a lot of times like rebuilt my music in a completely different way than also. So it's, to me, it's kind of all connected and one and the same,
Yeah, that's very, yeah. I mean, obviously that mentality lends itself incredibly well to working in games because it's such a team sport. It's such a collaborative medium that if you're overly auteurish and overly kind of precious, you'll get, at minimum, you'll get your ego bruised pretty badly, but you'll probably also, it'll be worse than that. It'll probably just be kind of incompatibly too difficult to collaborate with you from the perspective of an audio director. So obviously what you're describing is a very winning trait that, speaks to your continued.
Oops, you're cutting out there, Austin. Sorry.
Is this just a way to make me, I think this is a way to force me to say further nice things about you. Can you hear me now?
No, I hear you. Yeah, it's all good. I cut off my camera. Maybe that helped.
Yeah, no problem. What I was saying is this need for collaboration as a baseline requirement obviously, explains your continued career flourishing, and it also probably explains why some folks who have struggle because you can't be precious about these kinds of things. And I'm curious if that's something that you've always been, or did you have to kind of mature into that?
Kind of both, actually. So for the first, beginning years making music, I was very much a lonesome, creator and composer. And then when I started the studio, it became much more about a team and leading a team. So, at the same time as I'm doing composition, I got guys working on different projects or on the same project, cutting things up. It's a whole process that we'll set up depending on the project. And for me, it's kind of like even though I'm sitting here by myself playing all the stuff by myself, I kind of have an audience, like my engineer is my audience, and he's like a huge part of the process because I'm getting feedback like, okay, we're good, yes, this is all good, we got the next one, let's go, let's happen. And you get into a zone, and there's a whole like energetic undertaking that happens as a team level when we're doing these productions. And the reason I'm able to get so many tracks on is because I do have the support team, around me and behind me, constantly making sure that everything is set up, running, and we're ready to go. And when things get executed, it gets done. And then as soon as it's done, somebody else is already like, prepping it up, cleaning it up, and getting it out the door.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute as well. Your team and what you've built with the Hacienda, because that's, I think, also a bit atypical relative to other composers. You're kind of a fascinating, unique blend, because some folks build big teams, but it's not surprising because they're a traditional composer of hiring musicians to play these parts and whatever. So the notion of them having support is to be expected, given that. But since your brand, as it were, is so built around the idea that it's you playing these tracks and you're constructing it yourself, it's actually unexpected that you would have kind of a robust team that's able to deliver all that. So where did this come from? When did you start it? How big is the team? What does it consist of? And is the team as a company doing, like, are you guys also kind of doing sound design work? Is this a turnkey operation? Like, walk me through, because I know far more about you than I do about your company, as it were. So how does that interface with all this?
Yeah, it's so it is basically, it is kind of its own being, you could say, because they're working on probably several projects at the same time. And since like I am also a sound designer, like I went to school for sound design, I spent quite a few years doing full on mixing and sound design for a lot of projects as well as music. I'm super comfortable with that, so that's why I started La Hacienda. In the beginning, it was to do post-production for television, and then it turned into games, and it just kind of happened that it's at the same time that we were doing all of this sound design work and implementation, I was getting called on to do music. So I've kind of been doing both here, with the depending on what project it is and the year it is, although more and more now, my work as a composer is more prevalent, and I would say 90% of my production time is focused on the creative part of music at this point. But yeah, I got a bunch of talented fellas. Like they're amazing, man. They sound designers, engineers, administrators, coordinators, all that stuff is huge, and it helps the process. So when I come in, it's like this well-oiled machine, and when we set up a project, it's like, let's go, let's hit, and boom, it all happens. And that's part of the reason I can create all this stuff so fast. And people forget, like, you got to be a team player if you want to create great things in life. It will always be a team effort. It's very rare that you can you by yourself as a one-man team get to like you can, but it's going to take a lot longer, whereas if you got a team behind you backing you up and working with you, you can do things a lot more quicker and much more
100%.
enjoyably. It's more fun, actually, being able to share.
I've found the same thing. I really enjoy collaborating with, whether it's an orchestrator or obviously the musicians, and I've brought on people for synth work where I'll lay down a pass and I'll say, can you create things kind of inspired by this sound and iterate on it and send it back, or even commissioning people in the same vein as the Resident Evil stories. I've commissioned contact instruments and said, like, and my favorite situations are where I say, look, rather than send you source sounds that I make or point you towards a very specific color, I'm going to write a sentence and I want to hear your take on that very subjectively, and then I'll find a way to make it work. And that's just such a joy, because people come at you with things that you couldn't have directed them into. You wouldn't know to tell them to do that thing. They needed some more kind of arbitrary direction, as it were. And the nature of those kinds of collaborations, I think we have I think as a culture, composers are a little bit bred to have a kind of an egocentrism of, this needs to all be the brainchild of this one mad super genius, and it's somehow a failing of their creative integrity that they would collaborate with others. And it's wonderful that someone like you is so productively and healthily saying fuck you to that idea and really pushing back against it in such a beautiful way, and not because the alternative is often, well, the alternative is someone with an army of unpaid interns and ghostwriters who is in a more predatory way relying on a team that's not transparent, and you're neither of those things. You're like, no, I've got a team, and we all make each other better.
Yeah, totally. And
yeah, I think that's magnificent.
Yeah, no, and it's also a way to kind of give back, like talking about actually interesting. You mentioned the whole idea of interns. For me, it's like having I do, over the years, I brought in a lot of people. Actually, everybody that works with me now, they started off as interns here, and I basically brought them in, trained them, gave them the tools that they maybe lacked in their other previous education, and now they're amazing creators in themselves, and engineers. And so like, it's also part of it. Like, we're sharing and we're all doing our thing. So it's something that I'm also proud of, like to just like, okay, let's all grow together. And it's, as a whole, as a team, it's, and we're not just silos, as humanity, we gotta be working together too at this, where I think, maybe this is a more of a philosophical thing, but I think we've gone a little bit too individualistic these days as a whole species, you could say.
Well, yeah, I totally get what you mean. And I think a balance can be drawn because, everybody is unique. Everybody is sort of definitionally an individual. But I think onboarding that philosophy to the exclusion of kind of welcoming others is quite obviously counterproductive also. And especially when it comes to art and creativity, there's very few examples of people who kind of went off to a literal or metaphorical cabin in the woods and truly created something brilliant. And those that did, usually it came at great expense. You think of like the Emily Dickinsons of the world, who in their isolation created greatness, but also kind of lost their mind. And I think that what you are describing and kind of living as an embodiment of is hopefully a far more healthy and inspiring model for people to kind of look to and say that's not a bad way to be. I think it can be very intimidating for a younger composer because they think, oh, okay, so to get into the business, I need to have an RCA facility and a whole team and an engineer and 1,200 instruments, and they forget the trajectory of your life that it took to arrive there. And the idea that it must somehow come, like it's now a barrier to entry. It's a minimum starting position, which obviously you would
no, it isn't.
Reject.
And this is what I mean when I have worked with people with me, I don't hold back any secrets. There's no secrets to my process. I mean, you can ask me anything, I'll tell you straight up what it is, but because for me, like everybody will, the state of mind or however you end up creating this music, by maybe using some of the techniques I've used, or ways of thinking, it will come out completely differently. It's all depending on the person, and it's like everybody has their voice. I'm just finding ways to skip a lot of the noise and just get to it as fast as possible, as directly and as enjoyably as we can, even though it might be painful at times too. That's basically it.
Yeah, I love it. Well, I think that's a fantastic note to wrap this up on. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I think that forging through fire alarms and problematic Wi-Fi and all the rest of it. I meant it what I said earlier, that you were one of those people that when we first met, I remember hoping that you would be able to kind of find your corner of this business. We all end up kind of in our own little islands, but hopefully in a sustainable way and in a way that we can continue to have opportunities. And you were one of those people that I really wished that for, because your talent was very obvious, but you also just you came across so immediately, the way that you have here for the last hour and change as well, like just somebody who's an open book and very authentic and good natured about all of this, and doesn't take himself so crushingly overly seriously, but yet is a serious artist. And so it's very gratifying to see your continued ascendancy in the world of games. And I especially think that something we haven't tapped into as much here, but I think is going to also be a big part of the shadow that you cast moving forward is that you're a real kind of technologist beyond being a performer and composer with a unique outlook and a unique sensibility and perspective. And just knowing what you're saying about, building your own engine in which to host custom samples, and the idea of the implications that might have for the future of adaptive audio, but also knowing that you're building custom instruments in the supersonic realm, and knowing that you are exploring more kind of immersive audio, ambisonic, that kind of thing. I know that you've got your own little experiments in that territory as well. Installation work and physical immersion, physical immersive installation type audio. I think that you may end up being one of those people that kind of changes everything, or you might just be one of those people that makes all the rest of us go, damn, we're asleep at the wheel. We could be pushing that much harder on the creative frontiers ahead of us.
I would say it's not about pushing harder. I think it's just do what you do, and the right stuff is going to come out. I've just been very lucky that I've kind of like put myself out there, done what I do, and with, even though maybe sometimes I'll fall into a chasm, but that's what you have to do. You have to be willing to take a lot of risks for yourself, and even, like your life financially, even, in so many ways. That's a huge part of it. Sometimes, it can be pretty stressful, I have to admit, but it is what it is. And at the same time, like, lately, it's kind of like dawned on me. It's like, it's not just about music. Everything's connected, So yeah, the technology, the expression, the process. It's all, we can kind of create and connect our own ways of expressing ourselves as creators, whether it's through music or the technology and all, and it's all beautiful. I mean, we're just getting started. It's a great world we're in. We just gotta. Just keep the good vibes going, as you said.
Well, that's a perfect button on this whole thing. So I'm just going to close it there. So thank you, Brian. Mm-hmm. Good luck with the fire alarms.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully we'll see you in person again soon.
Oh, you cut out there for a second.
Of course.
Okay, here we go. You're back.
I just said, hopefully we'll have a chance to see you in person soon.
Yeah, definitely. So.
Thank you for joining us for the Game Maker's Notebook. For more information on the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, our podcasts, and our other initiatives, please visit www.interactive.org.